Well, there's no doubt that our demographics are changing. More of us are trading backyards for balconies and courtyards. More Australians are living in apartments. And it's not just because of the cost, it's because of the lifestyle advantages, because of where a lot of apartments are. But apartment construction comes in cycles because of the long lead time in doing these big developments, and we tend to find that there are oversupplies in various regions. But recently, Dr. Andrew Wilson, Chief Economist of My Housing Market, has come up with a new unit market index. So to find out what it's all about and what his research shows, let's have a chat with Andrew. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, it's always an interesting subject. It's, I guess, media fodder, that word oversupply. But as you so correctly suggested, we don't really get supply and demand matched in real time in the apartment market because of the very significant or the long production lead times that we have. And that means it's a lot more problematic matching the apartment supply with buyers than it is with detached housing.
Sure. So you've come up with a new index. Why? What led you to do this research, Andrew?
I just thought it was a way we could examine the proportion of new units in the marketplace as, I guess, a more of a real-time indication of matching supply and demand, Michael. So what I've done is track the number of listings of new apartments in each of the capital cities, these are brand new, versus the total number of apartments and units for sale in that capital city. So it's the proportion of new versus total, which is inclusive of new and established. And then we can compare it on a capital city by capital city basis to see just which capital city has the highest proportion of new units in the total unit market for sale.
And as you started to do this research, did any surprises pop up?
Well, I think it validates what we already know to some degree, Michael. And look, we know that most capital city markets, in fact, just about all of them, with the exception perhaps of Hobart, have had a very strong construction cycle for apartments over the last 4 or 5 years. Been a real boom in new apartments, particularly in Sydney and Melbourne. Of course, it's an issue of being able to match demand with that supply, particularly as we've had some outside interference, I guess, in terms of that demand. A lot of apartment demand was, in the early days of the boom, taken up by investors. Of course, investors were the target of particular policies designed to restrict credit to that group for various reasons, and that, of course, took away and is continuing to take away demand for new units. And I think it's no surprise that Sydney has 15.6% of total apartment listings are new apartments, and that's well ahead of Melbourne, which is 11.5% of its total apartments or units for sale being new, and Brisbane well behind that again at just 6.2%. I think it does show that from the actual numbers of supply that have come into the Sydney market over the past 3 or 4 years, that it's still a market in some areas struggling to clear that new listing stock.
I bet if you did this research a year ago, the statistics would have been a bit different. Brisbane had quite an oversupply then, Andrew.
I think what the interesting thing is when we move from comparing capital city with capital city is where we compare where the actual proportion at a local level is in the capital cities. And I think there's quite a divergence when we compare Sydney and Melbourne particularly. When we look at Sydney, the bulk of unsold apartments, new apartments in the market, are in the western suburbs. That's the outer western suburbs, areas such as Penrith and Liverpool and Kellyville. And in Melbourne, it's very, very much skewed towards the CBD, which has quite a significant proportion of unsold apartments compared to total. And once you move outside that CBD area, it becomes the choices for buyers for apartments become a lot narrower. And I think that does reflect the sort of planning restrictions there are for new units in the Melbourne metropolitan area. It's very much in CBD areas where the new development is and has been. Different in Sydney, where it has a different planning environment, where there has been quite robust development in the middle and outer suburbs, particularly the outer western and northwestern suburbs and southwestern suburbs as well. In Sydney, there's been quite a lot of development, and that's the areas where there is the most supply, the most unsold apartments, whereas the closer you get into Sydney, the less choices you have.
Well, if you came to Australia from overseas 10 years ago and you came back today, you wouldn't recognise any of our capital cities, all those high-rise apartments in town and in the outer suburbs. I guess one of my questions is, Do people really want them in the outer western suburbs of Sydney? Is that the reason there's an oversupply? If you live out there, is it really an apartment you want, or are you looking for a backyard and a front yard?
Well, I think people are more and more looking for apartments, Michael, but I think the affordability issue is what drives apartment living in those areas. Of course, we've got to understand that Sydney's got a significant planning policy designed to fragment the Greater Sydney Basin into two CBDs. Parramatta is evolving now as a secondary CBD to provide all the major infrastructure that the Sydney CBD does. So that means that the areas to the southwest and the outer west in Sydney really are focused on Parramatta as its CBD rather than Sydney. So perhaps in a way they're not really outer suburbs. They're really sort of middle ring suburbs when we compare CBDs with CBDs. And again, I think that's about sort of creative planning policies that have been designed to make the cities more functional and not have them sprawling further and further out from that central CBD location, which is what we have in Melbourne. But Melbourne sort of utilised its inner suburban areas, brownfield areas, to create higher density living. So,
well, Sydney's always been about a decade advanced from Melbourne with apartment living. You started a long time ahead of us. Now, we've got a screen at the moment, the Brisbane unit market. Brisbane isn't as big a city as Melbourne and Sydney. So how's the supply going there?
Brisbane really has had that sort of monoculture in terms of detached housing. It's come late again to apartment living, and it's mainly been along the riverside. Been strong development in areas such as West End and South Brisbane. And that's where the bulk of the new apartments are now in Brisbane in terms of new units for sale. But Chermside obviously has also been a suburban destination for high rise. So it's sort of picked up, I guess, a little bit of that Parramatta energy to some degree.
There's no doubt that more of us are going to live in apartments in the future. It's just the way we're tending to live. And a lot of people would like the idea of a new apartment, nice and fresh. But there's been some concerns. It started in Sydney with structural problems, then in Melbourne with cladding problems, and a little bit of cladding problems in Queensland as well. So it seems that consumers have become a bit nervous about buying new apartments. And I think that's going to taint the new developments for some time moving forward, Andrew.
Well, look, I'm not sure I agree with that, Michael. It's certainly been a lot of negative media around it. We're really only talking about a small amount of developments, and obviously it does affect sentiment. I'm not sure it is affecting it significantly.
In the past, investors in particular were interested in apartments. There was the tax benefits of buying off the plan and getting depreciation allowances and often rental guarantees. But many investors have found that there's too many fingers in the pie of the new apartment market, and they're not getting the capital growth. In fact, it often took 5-10 years to start getting capital and rental growth. But it really seems the domain of first home buyers at the moment.
Well, that's right, Michael. And we have, of course, the new policy coming in at the beginning of 2020, which will bring more first home buyers into the market, I'm sure. First home buyers will increasingly be looking at apartments as their destination to take advantage of what is a capped first home buyer deposit scheme.
Well, if you lived in Paris, if you lived in London, New York, you wouldn't expect to start in a home either. And our two big capital cities in particular, our three big capital cities really are international cities. And there's nothing wrong with starting in an apartment. I know that's where I started many, many years ago as well. So having discussed this new index, where do we go from here? What's ahead?
Well, Michael, we certainly are at peak supply in terms of Melbourne and Sydney. We know where that peak supply is. We know the demand factors are there that will act to absorb this unsold stock. We know that back end now really has nothing coming through. So it's not as though there's more properties set to come into the market. We've seen a remarkable collapse in approvals for new apartments, particularly in Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane. So once this stock is absorbed, we're likely to move perhaps into an undersupply given continuing strong migration, first home buyer activity, and of course confidence is returning to the market. And once we start to get some relaxation to what I still believe are lending restrictions to investors, we'll see more investors also looking at apartment markets.
And as the undersupply comes in and demand continues on, the value of established apartments is going to increase. It's going to mean the next round of apartments built are going to become more financially viable again. And the whole cycle will start once again, Andrew.
That's right, Michael, and it is all about those long construction lead times. But developers, it's for them, it's about risk and reward, and they take the risk of developing or having to develop a product a number of years in advance. But look, with a flatter interest rate cycle, it might be a little bit less risk and therefore a little bit less reward going forward, and a little bit less oversupply and a little bit less undersupply, Michael.
Well, thanks for that, Andrew. We'll keep an eye on your new unit market index.
Thanks, Michael.